Hi, I'm Dave. I'm the old engineer back again. Last time I talked about some things about my life that were sort of like 50 years ago, gave some background. This time I want to talk about a specific event that occurred some 32, 33 years ago that was the subject of a recent series on Netflix, which is the Challenger space shuttle disaster. I was around when that happened, and I actually saw it on TV not too long after the accident occurred, so I'd like to talk about that and talk about a couple of things that they didn't bring up in this series. In the Netflix series, they interviewed a lot of people that were there at the time. And they showed a lot of archival footage from the hearings and from the launch and from the backgrounds of the people that were there. But there were a couple of things they didn't mention. And there are two things that I want to talk about. One is a couple of people, specifically Roger Boisjoli, who was one of the engineers at Thiokol, and also Ed Tufte, who wrote a critique of the documents that were used when Thiokol was trying to communicate with NASA before the launch. You should realize that NASA was under a lot of pressure to do launches, and it showed because if you remember in the show, they said that they were trying to launch once every 2 months. Well, after the disaster, they reorganized things and looked at the schedule to see what was really feasible. And at the time, they had 3, then slightly thereafter, 4 shuttles. And so the launches ended up being roughly every 2 months, which indicates that it took about 6 to 8 months to actually get a shuttle ready to go again once it had been on a mission. One of the people that was featured in the series was Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel Prize winning physicist from 1965, who was on the Rogers Commission and contributed a lot to making sure that they were talking about science most of the time. He was really well known, still is. He was named one of the 10 greatest physicists of all time. He worked on the Manhattan Project in his early career and spent most of his career working with subatomic particles. He also designed something that's called the Feynman diagram, which explains how particles interact and convert into radiation and then back into particles, and how particles give off other particles and radiation. These Feynman diagrams are extensively used in particle physics to figure out what's going on and do energy balance equations and that sort of thing. He also wrote a series of, I think, 3 books called the Feynman Lectures on Physics. Now, these aren't really quite textbooks, but they are used extensively by students in college studying undergraduate physics because they're written so clearly and are relatively easy to understand, even though they delve into some deep topics in physics. Another person I want to mention is William Lucas, who was the director of the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center at the time of the disaster. He actually resigned in July, the same year that the Challenger blew up. The reason I want to bring up Lucas is if you look at the clip that they used in the Netflix series, he gives a comparison between his ancestors crossing the Appalachians into Tennessee, which is where he's from, and the launch of the space shuttle, saying that a lot of people lost their lives going over the Appalachian Mountains, and the loss of the space shuttle crew is the price of progress, basically. The only problem with that is this is what is called a false equivalency. And the difference between the two is what the lawyers call informed consent. When settlers went over the Appalachians, they knew what they were getting into. They had the stories from the guides and from other people that had tried, and all sorts of stories coming back from people that arrived to tell all the trouble that they had. Unfortunately, the space shuttle crew didn't have the same kind of information. They didn't know what the risks were during that launch. And so it's important when you hear things like this comparison that you apply critical thinking. In this series, we're going to talk a lot about critical thinking. I'm going to have some episodes that are just about that. And so it's important that people keep their wits about them when they're watching TV shows and looking at things on the internet, because there are all sorts of falsehoods that are propagated, and this is just an example of one kind. Now, there are two people that I want to talk about that were not in the Netflix series. I think this is probably because they both died before the series filming started, and the series was largely based on interviews and recollections of the people that they interviewed. And so the first is Roger Boisjoly. Roger was an engineer at Thiokol, and he was the one that pointed out back in July 1985 that there was a problem with the O-rings. And he identified actually two problems. One was called burn through, which is where the hot gases actually burn a channel in the O-rings so that the gases can escape. And there were two O-rings in each seal, so you can get burned through in the first one and the second one can still be good. The other problem was what's called blow-by, in which the rings never make a seal in the first place. And so as soon as there's pressure applied from the rocket motor, gas escapes. And this was the problem in the Challenger motor, as you'll see in a minute. Roger left NASA after all of this happened and basically spent the rest of his career studying and talking about engineering ethics. And he died of cancer in 2012. The other guy is Bob Ebeling. Bob was the engineering manager who wrote the famous help memo, in which he requested, in no uncertain terms, additional help in solving the problem so that it could be done before they did the next launch. And it didn't really get solved. He knew it, and he was the one that raised the alarm on the day of the launch that it was too cold to launch that rocket. Unfortunately, he was overridden by other people. He died in 2016. Blow-by. The reason I bring up blow-by is because that was basically the cause of the disaster. And you can see that in this picture. If you look carefully at the bottom of the rocket, you'll see that there is gray smoke coming out of one of the joints. This is a picture that was taken by one of the high-speed film cameras, because they didn't have live video on all these places at the time. This shows that just 5 seconds after ignition, there was already a leak visible between the lower sections on the rocket motor. That meant that when they went back and looked at this film later, they could see that 5 seconds into the launch, there was already nothing that they could do to avert the disaster. In the 90s, a guy named Edward Tufte, who was an expert in communications, especially graphic communications, wrote a book in which he included 20 pages on his analysis of the documents that were used to communicate the O-ring information inside the shuttle program. And his conclusion was that the documents were very obscure, very hard to understand. And so his book section is pretty much a critique of the program, which in effect accuses the Thiokol engineers of not communicating well enough to NASA. He produced a diagram showing what they should have done in order to present it. It's in one of his books. He's written several books about graphical communications, and it's in this one, Visual Explanations, about 20 pages on shuttle disaster. Later on then, Roger Boisjoly and several of the other engineers wrote a paper that basically contradicted Tufte, because it explained that a lot of the assumptions that he had made about data that was available and and some other things were just not quite true, and also pointed out that the diagrams that they were showing were well known to the people that they were sending them to, so this wasn't really new information. There have been 2 other films made about the Challenger disaster. One of them was called Challenger. It was made in 1990. It's a made-for-TV movie, and it was mostly about Roger Boisjoly. And for those of you who remember Peter Boyle played Boisjoly. The other film was The Challenger Disaster, which was done by the Discovery Channel in 2013. And that one mostly followed Richard Feynman through the Rogers Committee process and discussed the science involved. I was at work and I didn't see this live, but the company I worked for, which built video equipment, had a live video feed that came off the air, which we used for test signals. And so shortly after the disaster occurred, of course, it was on the news all over the place, and I saw the replays pretty quickly after it happened. It was sort of the subject of talking for the rest of the day. If you're interested in more information on the Challenger disaster or any of the other documents or things I talked about, you can see the references on my credits slide at the end of this. Also, I've started a website which will be up probably in a couple of weeks that will talk about background on all the episodes I prepare and give live links to documents and materials and things like these books. So if you want to look into them further, it makes it easy to follow up. In future episodes, I'll talk more about Ed Tufte and his books. He's the guy that can tell you when you make a table whether you should put lines in it or not between the table entries. He understands in which situations the lines communicate something and in which situations they obscure the information. He's done a lot of work in graphical communications and sort of has an infinite amount of comments on problems with PowerPoint. Anybody who does a lot of PowerPoint probably should look through his books to help learn how to communicate better. I'll have more of that in a later episode. Also in a later episode, probably several, I'll talk more about ethics. Probably the next one I'll do will talk about my personal ethics story, the one I mentioned in my last episode where I had to wear a wire. Please use the YouTube comment section to ask questions or suggest additional episodes or comment on anything that is of interest to you. Please subscribe so I can send you notices of future episodes. And I want to thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.